Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have a lovely panel, which I've tentatively titled Biophysical Realities and Cultural Potentials. It started, I tweeted something, and these lovely folks engaged in the thread, and we decided to turn it into a podcast because I think it's a fascinating topic. I'll introduce the panel. So we have Nathan Gates, Craig Cassel, Ellie Young, and Richard Flyer. And so I think how we'll roughly frame this conversation. First, I guess I'll have all of you introduce yourselves. Let's start there before I move on. Let's have all of you introduce yourselves. 2 minute, something like that, and then we'll go from there. So I'll let anyone who wants to start, go for it.
I'm Richard Flyer. Currently, my wife and I were in Oahu, and my interest has been doing bioregional ecosystem building. So focusing on building capacity in local communities by connecting nonprofits, for-profits, local government around areas of like increasing the local production and consumption of food. So that's a passion for a long time, but actually I'm more passionate about the building of networks like that. Not necessarily food, but just like how to build community and how to create, I think what we need is a new culture. And it's actually not necessarily new as in new values. We just have to practice the values that are important to bringing people together. So real excited about exploring cultural change at the base of societal change, starting locally, but then within every community on the planet. And this seems to be happening organically. Got some experience with Sarvodha in Sri Lanka, which is a great example of how you can build a national network of bioregional ecosystems and local economies. They've been doing that for 60 years, and they've got a lot of things to teach us in the West, and happy to be here.
Nice. And if you want to learn more about Richard's work, we interviewed him solo a few episodes ago. I don't remember exactly which one, but you can find him under Richard Flyer. All right. Ellie, I'm going to call on you.
All right. So I'm Ellie Young. I'm founding a network called Common Action. And basically, this is sort of a knowledge network for expressing the kinds of problems that we are facing in different geographical locations, and then mapping that to solutions and also to like the people that are doing those solutions. So innovators in spaces, companies, organizations, individuals, groups like Richard Flyers and so on. So we're really just trying to create like this, large scale mapping capacity, so we can begin to kind of see like where and what the problems are, wrap our arms around them, and move more quickly together to address those.
Nice. Thank you. Greg?
Hey y'all, I'm Greg Cassel. So I have some decades of background in philosophy and arts, but I've had a second life since 2014. I really got very focused on organizational theory and organizational development. I became an anarchist, focused on consent-based organizing models, got involved in a lot of related networks and discussions. I've developed a lot of open source documents, which I call inclusive organizing patterns and systems, which are focused mostly on low technology practices that are mostly compatible with oral processes as well as written exchanges, but also can be scalable with different types of technology. And at the same time, I work for Neighborhoods, which is a holochain-based project. And for people who aren't familiar, holochain is like a bunch of people's, including my idea of what blockchains ought to actually be. Not a single global supposed state of truth for some potentially massive ledger, but a bunch of distributed, decentralized ledgers that might be connected to each other in different ways, and distributed apps that can be connected in all kinds of ways. So Neighborhood specifically is a project to develop social sense-making tools and small apps that can be very intentionally combined and customized by diverse communities. So we have a model of generic tech and specific culture, which is very community-based. Um, since I've lived with my partner in North Metro Atlanta for the last 6 years, I've gotten very into organic, native plant, wildlife gardening, and began to identify more and more with permaculture in a very grounded physical sense. In addition to, identifying social permaculture with everything else I do. And I'm very glad to be here with y'all.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. Nathan.
Hi. So I'm Nate. It's kind of a fun timing for me. It feels a little auspicious to be here talking right now. It's almost precisely the 10-year anniversary since my wife and I, with our two kids who were young at the time, moved east from Colorado to the farm that we inhabit now. So it's been exactly a decade. So we packed up, we lived in Denver and, had our lives there and decided to come back and live on her family's abandoned farmstead. And, it's been a process. It's been a fixer upper. And it was just really why, looking back on it, it was a hell of a thing to do. I just opened up. I'm a counselor by trade. And so that was how we were going to support ourselves. I moved here, opened up a private practice that I needed to get to full-time immediately so that we could, make a living and did that. And then have been rehabbing the farm, ever since. And so along the way, we have learned a great deal about living here. We're both, Emily's from here and I'm from Southern Illinois, but to come back here as adults and, to make a life and to try to rehab a farm, learned a whole lot and, trying to make community and make culture, in the grain belt and make a relationship with the land that we live on. So I guess I'm feeling pretty reflective at the 10-year anniversary and also to be a, psychotherapist in a rural community too has been, quite an experience. And I think a lot about, when we talk about change and talk about cultural change, it's like, well, what are the messages and the learnings and the patterns of thought and the ways of perceiving the world that all of us have that keep us engaged in this pattern? We're all engaged in this pattern, and how to break free from this pattern because our minds are very entrained to it, to the very detail of how we perceive the world around us. And the change doesn't happen very easily at all. So, and I'm fascinated by that change on a personal, but then also a collective scale.
All right. Well, I'm very excited. Excited about all of your bios. I think this is going to be a great conversation. So let's get started. So I think I'm just going to, not to show my own tweet, but I think I'm just going to read this tweet that kind of got this conversation started and kind of is where I'm coming from. Perhaps it's a little bit more quote unquote realist than maybe I am on every day, but I'll go ahead and read it. So I wrote the seemingly inexorable maximum power principle is why I am a doomer before I am an optimist. There likely won't be an integral or solar punk or whatever mass awakening before biophysical constraints grab us by the scruff of the neck and throw us into the future. Okay. I wrote this tweet because I was feeling like there's a lot of kind of optimistic hopium online, and I'm seeing, climate change projections. I'm seeing people talking about peak oil and probably a much lower energy throughput future. Perhaps not, but I think it's more likely than not personally. Of course, ecological collapse of various different sorts, political implosion in the United States, in many other places. So many kind of signs of what we might call collapse. Just to put it frankly, or collapse of the systems of the industrial modernity that we've become accustomed to. And so that's kind of me putting my cards on the table. I kind of think that we're headed to a very different future in, in the next 1 to 3 decades. But I just want to kind of see what the consensus or non-consensus is in terms of, what do we think that just kind of our physical reality, like what affordances are available to us, what new challenges are we going to face in the next 1 to 3 decades? And so if everyone just wants to, how are they seeing the future in this way?
I guess I can. Go ahead, Nathan.
I try to cultivate sort of an agnostic attitude on that question intentionally, because I can really go into the doomer place for sure, and have found myself struggling with that a lot. And then go to the head in the sand place. And I think it's as likely as not that we're like knee deep in collapse. And, it's the kind of thing where you look back and be like, oh, wow, that was well on its way in 2022. And at the time we're just kind of looking around thinking like, why is all this weird shit happening? But I don't know. And there's also the part of me that thinks like, well, maybe this just limps along for like a really long time in ways that I can't anticipate, or that there is. And I'm not talking about like a whiz bang, tech solution that solves everything, but just kind of limps along more or less kind of okay. And maybe there's some improvement here, and like, I don't know. So I try to cultivate being agnostic on the question of what's going to happen, and more just focus on what I think is important, just in life in general, that I see, as missing. I think, community is missing. I think a lot of connection is missing. I think the way that we live is really alienated and disconnected. And so to center that, to center a more, way of living is more harmonious with other people, and the earth we live on, like, regardless of what happens next, that's just good to do. And so that's where I try to put my focus, because, and again, try to not to get too in the space of trying to anticipate, well, what will it be, or where are we at? Are we gonna, run out of oil? Is there going to be, tribal warfare everywhere? Like, I don't know. And I don't have the, if I did know, I'd be full of shit. We're bad at predicting the future.
Maybe I should go next, because I mostly agree, I think, with Nathan, with a sort of agnostic attitude in which I try to embrace uncertainty and pluralism, and being prepared for a wide variety of contingencies. I think my general theory on planning is that it must be done at drastically decreasing resolution or levels of detail once we start speculating, like even 2 to 3, 6, 12 months or more into the future, and probably much more than ever right now, because the rate of interaction and of different economic and political developments right now is so rapid. There's been sort of an exponential growth in human activity. And if we look at how things have changed over even the last few decades compared to all of history before then, or if we look at the last few hundred years compared to all of history before then, we see an exponential curve. So things are really moving quickly. There's a lot of uncertainty, but we do need to think about, talk about, and prepare for all sorts of opportunities and risks, including the risks of total collapses where social and political structures collapse so badly that there's a great risk of, say, the roving warlord mentality taking hold in powerful subgroups or subcultures, et cetera. And to me, the answer to that is generally, you know, I'm always going to promote developing an inclusive and compassionate culture, but that's looking past this general subject of, I guess, of optimism versus pessimism. So we can talk about that later if it shows up. But for me, one of the main wildcards here is we're looking at energy systems as they've been, the fossil fuel economy gradually tapering off or falling off a cliff, at the same time that we're trying to develop different types of renewables that will make up for some, but not all of that. And at the same time, we all see probably at this point many news articles about nuclear fusion reaction developments, which could actually be going somewhere. And to me, that's really interesting because it's a huge wild card. And I don't see it as a panacea. I see it actually as this huge wild card, which would dramatically amplify a bunch of opportunities and risks, mainly perhaps because of its very deep association with the predominant economic forces, with governments, with big industry, et cetera, with centralization. So for people that advocate progressive decentralization and localism, I think it's important to be ambivalently interested in whatever does or doesn't happen with fusion technology.
Just to interject, it just brought it to my mind real quick. I did a poll a while back of like, you know, two axes of centralization and high or low centralization and higher low energy future, just kind of see what people thought was going to be the case and what they hoped would be the case. And I think I remember that it was pretty split on, it was pretty split down the middle, but when people say what they desired, it was split between decentralized high energy and decentralized low energy. And I think the thinking was exactly what you're saying, Greg, of, well, more energy could definitely, if it was used wisely, could be a great boon. Say we could reach the activation threshold to recycle, say, high-tech, metals and other things, which could help us create closed loop economies, but can also lead to more economic and political centralization and authoritarian, control. Whereas the decentralized low energy, there's of course the risks of just a lot of people dying due to just lack of food and heating or various other things. But it could also perhaps afford a little bit more freedom, kind of in a localist sense. And so that's a very interesting. We can go more down that track in a while, but I just wanted to flag that it's interesting kind of.
Can I tack something on very briefly? Part of the uncertainty here is what are going to end up being the startup costs of fusion reactors if they do succeed, like small fusion reactors. Is that something that might end up being compatible with local or regional organizing forces at fairly small scales versus the massive bureaucratic centralized forces that dominate the global economy right now?
Right. All right. Richard or Ellie, let's go next.
Yeah, I have some ideas here. So I think there's a couple of interesting thoughts. We're talking about energy. We're talking about sort of centralization, politics, government, business. But there's other things that are maybe more immediately tangible, right? So like water and condition of ground. And when we think about collapse, I mean, the system, the systems that we rely on are not just going to vanish like tomorrow all at once in some kind of crazy blaze, right? There's more like what we'll see is what we've, been seeing, which is disruptions. And the question then is, what happens next? Do we replace what was disrupted with something else? Does it completely vanish? Is there an innovation? So I think a lot of the sort of unknownness of what will happen and come to actually pass is based on that, right? Like our resilience and our response across the scale. And so one thing, that I'm, I guess I feel encouraged by this. I mean, we all sort of have a ambivalence about government, especially in the US today. but there's a lot of people who literally know how to do a lot of really technical work, right? And they're, probably not going to vanish anytime soon. So there's always going to be a lot of responsive capacity. And I think that when we think about like, the raw fear of like, oh my God, resource collapse, right? Like we just automatically assume that we're back in, the like prehistoric time. and that's probably not going to happen. It'll be more like, oh, something here, there's, energy blackouts that are starting to happen in one location. And so we kind of have to allocate, right? It's more of a load problem, and how well do we do that, et cetera. So, I think that when sort of I think about like what the strategy is that somebody should be thinking about, it's like, what is your level of dependency on really robust, or not robust, right? But like really like entrenched and like complicated structures, because that might not, like if there's, multiple failure points, and probably one will take one out at some point. That's the whole supply chain problem. So if you're thinking about like yourself, right, what do you really need to survive? You need warmth enough, to get through like cold winters if you're in a place like that, and you need food and water. And to the extent that like local environments can support that, I think people are relatively okay. I don't think we know that. I don't think we know how to go kind of set those things up. And of course, looking at climate, it's kind of hard to know how that might all change. But really, I see a lot of, reason to be kind of encouraged that we're moving towards different philosophies at a scale that's sort of like really surprising, and a speed that's, kind of might be sufficient to get some like beachhead set up in advance of the kinds of things we're talking about.
Nice. Yeah, I really, a model that when you're talking brings to my mind is the anarchy model of systems change, where you have some kind of release, or it's called release collapse, however you want to put it, and how you're putting it is kind of like there's some kind of situation, and then it's like how do you adapt? How do you reorganize? And yeah, I just wanted to put in, I would much prefer a situation where it's more of a stair step. The current system cannot maintain itself. Parts of it kind of become dysfunctional, and then we have time to adapt before the next. I would prefer, I think all of us would much prefer that to kind of like, a doomsday scenario. But yeah, so Richard, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's not funny, ironic, but just I've been focusing on the cultural piece, like really sensitive to our culture, not really feeling a part of it, having a lot of inner spiritual experiences when I was a kid, and how that kind of oriented me towards a world that I felt a sense of oneness and connection, looking at the world. Yes, there's community, but there's brokenness. So I've always engaged that. And I've just seen like the fact that we have accepted, 30,000 kids dying of preventable disease every day globally. It's, if you think about it, we've just grown accustomed to it. So from my perspective, when I started doing anti-nuclear organizing in the early 80s, I think we're in like a slow apocalypse. So it's a slow apocalypse. It's this kind of ongoing thing. Now, it doesn't mean that, I'm freaking out, but for me, the way I have related to that is build community. So, while guns and ammo might be good for an individual and a family, if everybody on your block gets guns and ammo, what does that mean? So I've been focusing on neighborhoods, like how we can grow more food, how we can get people to build a new culture. So the culture we have, I call it a culture of separation. It's the belief that we're all separate from each other, separate from nature, but it's really a materialistic perspective on life. It's a lie to me. It's propagated. And that's why we're in this slow apocalypse, because that kind of cultural value, which focuses primarily on money, on power, on dominance, on centralized power, on centralized, economics, it's all part of the same system. And it seems to me that its logical kind of direction is a global authoritarian rule. That's where it's headed. COVID was just the beginning of this process. Now, does that mean I'm a prepper? No, not really, but I've been probably prepping my whole life, like culturally and spiritually preparing to just understand the difference between the culture that we have and the culture that what I internalize inside, the world I want to build. I really have to distinguish it. What's really interesting is that we don't have to go too much into it now, but maybe later on, is being in Sri Lanka for 5 months this year as they were in a collapse. I wondered whether that's the canary in the coal mine. In other words, I was like, it was not as serious for me in terms of the power outages, the fuel shortages, the diesel shortages, all those things that the people were suffering under. Just the fact that it was happening, it kind of really changed me, a lot. Like I was experiencing it with them, protest movements, taking out their government, like literally, taking out the presidency, the guy fled, and to observe that, it really affected me, and to see their response to it, especially non-governmental parts of society, the Sarvodaya movement and their infrastructure, how they got people on board on preparing, in the sense of, and taking care of themselves through methods of sharing and cooperation. That's the cultural piece that I think is the hope. So when I came back to Hawaii, where my wife and I live, I think it changed behavior. Like I started thinking about fishing. We live near the water. I started getting to know my neighbors in terms of connecting them around the different food sources that we have, backyard farming, looking at building a backyard farming network, because there's a ton of it here. So I think we can increase capacity. So that's how I respond to it. I'm almost in this liminal state continuously. So the question of whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist is just irrelevant. I'm just there, wherever that is. It's movement towards something positive. And I just kind of like, just keep going and try to build a new culture as best we can, build the infrastructure to prepare for whatever happens in whatever time frame, but it's bound to happen. There's just no way to avoid a culture that has really narrow values of money and power and separation. It just cannot last. Don't know whether it's next year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years.
Yeah. So it seems like there's a common thread here of folks saying that there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't actually know what's going to happen in what order, in what kind of geographic time frame. But what we can do is we can build resilience, build a kind of regenerative kind of culture starting locally. Of course, Greg and Ellie and Richard, you're all kind of involved with building networks and kind of organizational work. And so that seems to be kind of a response of like, no matter what happens, even in a very affluent society, these things are really important. And we're seeing, a lot of the side effects of that. Hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth. So you've all kind of also talked about culture. I was talking about biophysical realities, and I think we probably can't separate culture from biophysical realities because they co-inform each other. But to shift a little bit, a week or two ago, I had a recording with a Catholic reactionary named Michael Thomas. He would probably share a lot of the same diagnoses of the unsustainability of our current civilization. And his critique is basically that things like modernity and liberalism are tied up, inextricable from industrialization, like industrial technology and technocracy. And so he sees basically kind of, rediscovering boundaries, centers, as you put it, limits, and really the only way to do that, in his mind, it's like Catholicism, right? It's the Catholic, he's kind of trying to revive the Catholic land movement, but kind of very conservative, and he's very emphatic to emphasize reactionary, kind of a reactionary response to kind of our current civilization. So do you all kind of want to respond like why what do you think he's missing? Like, what is his blind spot that he's missing other cultural potentials, like other pathways besides, basically, say feudalism, or something like that with a king. I think he's also, partial to monarchism with a king and very hierarchical kind of societal structures.
I really want to jump in on this one
Yeah.
because I was actually part of the conversation with Michael, and it left quite a sour taste in my mouth. So I think what Michael is missing is like 2,000 years, right? Like, like we've learned some things, and we don't need only to read a book and like all practice the same style of behavior in order to avoid killing each other and like putting people in Iron Maidens. I think like his strategy of communication was very hostile, right? Like he was using, a lot of really aggressive words, really disgusting kind of like, he brought up like images of, girls that had been gotten surgery for to like remove their breasts and the transgender thing, and just like super like just vivid, right? Mm-hmm. And he also absolutely refused to talk to anyone who wasn't Catholic. I guess, you were the exception. So to me, this kind of says everything, right? Like he's not engaging in network-based approaches. He's not actually open and receptive to the people around him. And that sort of tells me that like what he's doing is not based on what's happening around him, right? Like I think that we have a little bit more negotiatory capacity, and while there might be like, I mean, certainly if there were like sort of the kind of collapse conditions that we're talking about, right? Like instantly there's chaos, no one really knows what to do, but after a little while, like some kind of organization naturally emerges, right? This is what we see after disasters, and basically we're talking about a disaster event. So, I mean, I don't think that we're like, there's absolutely nothing we can do, right? We have lots of resources around. There's going to be energy for a while. Like, I think that we absolutely are going to be moving back into, more local solutions just because that's who's around. I mean, yeah. A really interesting, I'll say this and I'll stop talking, but there's a really interesting book that the Swedish government puts out. Like they publish this every year, and it's titled something like What to Do in the Event of like War and Natural Disaster. And it's literally like, we're not going to be able to respond if there's a massive, like thing that happens everywhere. So you need to do these things, right? And I think that we're just like really not used to doing that. So we're all sort of like, oh God, what do I need to like learn? My hands are really soft, right? Like, should I learn how to like shoot a gun? I don't know.
Yeah. Anyone else wanna?
Jason, I think you could talk a little bit, just if you don't mind, because I missed that conversation. Do you mind sharing just a little bit of what this Michael Thomas was talking about? Was he talking about values, or was he talking about something else?
Back on, so there's Chris Mage in the Account Tradiste, forget his real name, are trying to organize kind of a neo-distributism conference. So distributism comes from Catholic social teachings. Belloc and Chesterton are some of the main kind of intellectual authors of it. And basically the idea is it's kind of a reaction to both capitalism and communism. It's basically saying we believe in private property, but well-distributed private property. And then you can have village economies, and you can have commons kind of on top of that when it's appropriate. And he kind of came in and said, well, I'm not interested because Chris Mage was talking about how we want to like bring a lot of people to the table, very inclusive, including socialists, communists, and others, and he was saying like no commies, right? Like no socialists. That's just he was just being very firm about that. And I guess his view is that it would basically like they would co-opt the process or something, and it would stray away from the Catholic values that originally informed it. So that's where he's coming from. I saw those interactions, Ellie. I agree that his online approach is very combative and distasteful. I actually mentioned that when I talked to him. His response was that you have to understand where I'm coming from and how besieged I feel in my values with modern society. And so he was basically saying like, I know I'm kind of being a troll online. This is why, and so like, well, I still don't approve of it. But yeah, I mean, I guess if I could say one thing after talking with him, it's that, he has, for him, from his point of view, he has deep philosophical and spiritual reasons for what he does. I don't know if they're, justifications or rationalizations, but there's, he wanted to convey and I felt a very kind of, in kind of being in a very sincere way that, this is why I do this thing. Anyway, you all can watch that recording. It'll come out before this one. But anyway, I want to give Greg and Nathan, if you guys want to.
Yeah.
Well, if I were to, it reminds me of, and I was, in that sort of online interaction too, and I've been paying a lot of attention to this sort of debate about distributism because it's super interesting. And it seems to me it comes like, to put it kind of in a broader context, this perspective is one that I would say is like sort of like this what's been popularized is, like Roger Ayers talked about, this Benedict option, where it's really focused on a sort of a purity of like, hey, this is what this tradition is, and we need to make sure to ensure the purity of this because it works, right? And so like trying to mix and blend, all it does is sort of dilute what we have, which is a full system that actually works. And so really focused on preserving that and not, not open to feedback. Which, if a person, wants to live that way, I mean, I think that that's part of my perspective is, I guess, let 1,000 flowers bloom. If you want to have a localist sort of community that does that, I like, okay, to me, the what adaptability is, which is what we're talking about. Adaptability is when you are in touch with the contingencies of your environment, and I think that ideology and dogma disconnect one in general from the contingencies of your environment, right? You're in touch with your own systems of thought. You're in touch with your own, your own conceptual understanding of the world, which is fundamentally always at odds with what's actually the contingencies in your environment. Sometimes they're closely overlapped, enough where they can be useful, but concept is never the same thing as the thing itself. And so the way that we conceptualize and live in terms of our concepts and our ideologies is always at a little bit of a distance. And if we're talking about rapid change, then maintaining contact with the what's actually happening, seems essential. And to me, a monoculture, so one way of doing things, is the exact wrong way to do that. And we talked about collapse earlier, and living here, in the middle of the Corn Belt, it's always amazing every year. And I'm always amazed that you can just plant 1 million acres, whatever, unfathomable acres of the same crop, and just see it all come up and just pokes up, and then it looks like this really, beautiful in a way, undeniably beautiful, actually. Like it's very pleasing in some way, but also it's sort of disturbing to me in another. But it seems to me that that's the most likely sort of thing to collapse, whether it's in a cornfield or whether it's in a homogenous culture. Because it's just one thing. So if that particular thing is the thing that goes wrong, it blows the whole thing up. And so, any sort of rigid ideology, rigid approach, rigid one way sort of view seems to me to be sort of inherently fragile. And at odds with the history of life on Earth. I mean, look, like humans have lived in all environments, in all circumstances, and they haven't done so with a single, view of the world. They've done so with a bunch of idiosyncratic views of the world, and it's gone on for tens of thousands of years, and I think probably will continue to go on in some form for thousands more, likely. I don't know, but it will happen because people adapt to the contingencies that surround them. That's why humans live. We're really adaptable. That's it. Not because we have like the best ideas of how the world works. It's because we adapt to the shit around us.
Yeah, just I guess one note. So you took the argument further. I made the argument, kind of pushback I made with him was that like kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom. We don't actually know, what is the most adaptable, what's viable, what's desirable. We're not going back. There's not going to be a return where we forgot the last 200 years or whatever happened, we're going to have knowledge and technology and various things. And he was very insistent that, well, if you're dealing with ecological constraints, it imposes these kind of cultural constraints. And he was saying, well, you know, Catholicism takes many different forms around the world. So that was kind of his like nod at pluralism. But he was, you know, basically saying like, no, you need to have like family at the center, a high, you know, patriarchal structure. He seemed very convinced of that. At one point, I think in a different context, I brought, well, you know, you're mainly talking about the post-agricultural revolution. You know, we can go further than that, and you know, open up, history even further than that. Anyway, Greg, do you wanna answer that?
I probably don't want to dwell on that much more, but thank you for bringing it up. I respect distributism and subsidiarity and a number of ideas that have come through Catholicism, as well as also sometimes in other forms and shapes, right? But it sounds like Michael's reactionary traditionalist perspective was very dogmatic. Kind of fundamentalism isn't a term we usually use with Catholicism per se, but, you know, in a more generic sense of religious fundamentals, very dogmatic. And yeah, you kind of hit on the nail on the head, I think, in a way, Jason. Something that is missing from that perspective is, you know, metaphorically speaking, there's a whole shitload of genies that have come out of bottles that are broken now, I think. There's a lot of information in the world. Even if we like had the most catastrophic electromagnetic pulse imaginable, and every hard drive in the world was wiped out, and we had a massive conflagration, and all written materials were somehow magically destroyed. Still, as long as people are living, there's quite a lot of information and ideas that have been developed over the last several thousand years, and especially the high tech of the last century or two, that is replicable, so long as there's some resources. And what would happen, you know, in a very profound reversion to traditionalism, I think, is kind of like maybe almost equivalent to someone going back in time and handing a bunch of high-tech tools to some but not all cavemen or hunter-gatherers. You know, that sort of the economic the asymmetrical economic distribution we have now, which is a reflection of our history of domination culture and violence, and taking that back into some more traditional perspective, but kind of magnifying whichever, such as patriarchal forces, domination forces, and bureaucratic forces that some people might prefer, I think would be terribly catastrophic and regressive. But I think partly, I should try to wrap up. I think partly that kind of perspective, that reactionaryism, is one of the casualties of our cultural wars and our political polarization. And that's partly because of modern social media, also mainstream media to some extent, but especially social media polarizes so much. And we have so much of this false dichotomy, not just between conservatism and liberalism or progressivism, but on a more profound level between conservation and progress, when in reality there's got to be a balance between conservation and progress for any living system. And we need to see that and work with it, and develop inclusive culture that progresses when it needs to, but does have safety, security, and conservation of the energy and the resources that are important to each family and to each community.
Nice, nice.
Could I make a comment, Jason? Even though I wasn't privy to the conversation, I've got some parallel thoughts that might be useful.
Sure. Yeah, please.
First thing is, you guys probably all are familiar with Mondragon, the cooperative model in northern in the Basque region. Yeah, that was actually started by a Catholic priest in the 30s who was looking at Catholic manuscripts regarding economics and injustice and social Catholic social teaching. So that was the first thing. That's just kind of like a fun fact. You know, what's really interesting is I missed this guy, and I'm sure this is one of those things where you've got this imperfect human being, like expressing this in such a dramatic way that it might cause us not to see something under the surface that could be true, just because we don't like him. And it doesn't sound like a likable guy. But let me tell you what I've been...
Real quick, I really hope you listen to the interview. I still don't think you'll agree with him 90%. Or maybe 50%, but
okay.
I found him to be a very, in some ways, relatable and sympathetic character.
Okay.
I just want to put those cards on the table that he comes across very different talking face to face than he does when he's in troll mode online. So I just want to put that.
I got you. Okay.
Go for it. Mm-hmm.
No, thank you. Yeah, so something that I've noticed about modern movements, like regenerative movements for regenerative community, is they tend to be still in a postmodern value system or metamodern, postmodern. And what I'm suggesting is that a lot of us who have this, observation of history going from, quote, traditional culture, which has to do with a particular monotheistic worldview, to a scientific or a modern view, then postmodern, postmodern modernism, is that many people who are more, quote, inclusive on one level are actually excluding the traditional viewpoints when it comes to value systems. Now, I'm not talking now about prescriptions for family structures or patriarchy. I'm talking about the fundamental values that have come about in thousands of years of historical cultural evolution across all faiths, not just the Christian or Judeo-Christian one. Take the Golden Rule as an example. So the Golden Rule, somebody could argue, if you're more coming from a spiritual or faith tradition, that the Golden Rule is part of a universal operating system. Like it literally, somehow there's some self-emergent consciousness, whether it's however you view that, whether it's external or internal or collective. But the fact is that it's embodied in nature, it's embodied within us. Now, a postmodern view is these things are invented by human beings. Like we just create the Golden Rule because it works, treat others as you want to be treated, mutual benefit, that kind of thing. The real challenge is that the postmodern view of values of cultural relativism is a threat to traditional spiritual and faith views, and they are under threat. And I identify with that myself, even though I am not, a religious person or person of faith. So I could see how that is important. In fact, I believe the fact that that entering into commerce, business, organizations in our culture causes us to sacrifice principles of the Golden Rule or universal love or inclusivity, all these things that have been championed in history underlying religion. I'm not talking about the organization. I'm talking about these really deep spiritual principles that are universal and still true. Those things are, I consider, part of a traditional view. So in my approach to cultural and community development, I include them, and I'm honest when I do my community work that the values of love, of forgiveness, of all these high principles that have been taught and brought down to us that are traditional are still true. And I do that so that people don't think I'm trying to reinvent something. There's no need to reinvent those. Those part of traditional religious and spiritual teachings are still valuable to build community, and they've been rejected by the secular culture. And that is one reason why we're having this cultural war. Of course, cultural war is manufactured and constructed by politicians and other leaders to divide us. But this could be a source of, and I use these general principles as a source of bringing people together. So that's what I want to see. I want to see like the regenerative community movements make common cause with the Christians who are into land stewardship. I don't see them doing that, because I believe that they're judging or separating from and lumping all the, quote, traditional values into this monolithic kind of state. So I've personally been reaching out to some Christians that are like homesteaders. They've built some national movements. It's interesting, many of the conservative Christians would agree with this critique that we're describing. They just have a different language for it. So in terms of actual being part of regeneration, it includes an ecosystem of all these different ideas. And I think some of them are excluded from our conversations with the usual suspects. And we need to figure out how to do that. I'm doing my best to navigate that, following the breadcrumb trails into unknown territory, right? But it means that I've got to go beyond my own likes and dislikes and not see people monolithically, like, oh, they're Christian, therefore they're Trump supporters, or they're Christian, or therefore they're probably not stewards of the earth, or whatever, bullshit you might think. Anyway, end of sermon.
I think if we drop back to the idea of what we're here to talk about, which is biophysical realities, right? Like real things around us, a lot of those problems kind of vanish. I mean, we have a lot of arguments happening because we live in a highly intellectualized context, right? And that's not the same thing as how do I get enough water today? So, really, like, I think if people have that experience, we're going to see more of that kind of like emergence of, negotiation and things that happen or that naturally kind of work. And also possibly not that, right? The sort of the opposite approach, which is, violence or whatever conflict. But I think that's kind of like the space that we're in now, but the space that we're going into is a little bit more raw.
Have any of you read the World Made by Hand series by Howard Kunstler?
Mm-hmm.
So the premise of the book basically is that it's basically like a collapse scenario, like electricity just kind of at some point stops, there's like a war, and but he kind of traces out an interesting structure where there's like three different types of communities living very close to each other, interacting with each other. And one is kind of like this more democratic kind of civic republicanism in town, where they have like town meetings and various things. One is like a very religious traditional community who move in, they start interacting with this community. And then there's kind of like this neo-feudal kind of like this kind of rich guy who invested a lot of like infrastructure before the collapse. And he's like a benevolent, feudal lord, where he basically has a bunch of people, serfs on his land, taking care of things, but he's definitely kind of the boss. And it kind of goes like how these three communities interact with each other. It's quite fascinating. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. It might be worth checking out.
So, I mean, like from my perspective, if let's say like in your community tomorrow, there was no energy and that didn't change, like, do you expect that there would be a war right outside your window? Like immediately everyone gets their guns and like goes after each other? Or is it more like, oh shit, like the grocery store is not going to be refilled. Like now what? Right? Like, the transition, which we all kind of skip over, is the thing. Like literally, what do you do if your environment is one that has a critical fail? And how do you talk to people about that in advance of it happening, right? Because I mean, I think as you pointed out, Jason, like the whole thing that we're doing is organization, because we don't have systems of, I mean, I read something recently that basically everybody in the US was on a farm 100 years ago. That was not that long, right? But like we have totally lost all of that infrastructure. So it's not that we're going into a place that's like hearkening back to medieval Europe, which is what, this kind of concept of like theory and or of theology and, so on, like reminds me of, at least, personally. It's more like just how do we rebuild that basic living structure of like, eating food, right? Like, and can we do that before and get enough support from our local, our neighbors to do that before we really like kind of need it right now this month.
I kind of like to jump in with a kind of like Richard, maybe a very, very generic and milquetoast half-assed defense of traditionalism. Just insofar as, when I heard you talking about, Richard, it made me think about like sort of like Huxley's perennial philosophy, right? Like this, which essentially gets at that, like there is a reality, there's a way things work. It's there. It's real. It's how the world is, right? And then we develop all these different systems to sort of like describe that, right? And that's what all these different religious traditions are. And that they exist still because they have in certain contexts worked, right? There's been insight in those religious traditions that have worked, that have been either, accurate enough or workable enough, like they've adhered closely enough to whatever this reality thing that we are in is, that they've sort of continued to survive and guide people's choices. And so if we do think about a scenario, like it's just, one of the things that I'm, being on the farm and moving here and just like kind of like learning how to do everything from scratch, including, making a living and going to town and having to drive, like do all of this stuff. It's so complicated and spread out and feels so disjointed and scattered. And, I've joked around often that I feel like, damn, I need to like invent an entirely new worldview just to make a simple decision about what I want to have for breakfast. Like that's how disjointed life can feel sometimes, because I don't imagine that gets any easier after collapse. So there does, I feel like, have to be a common view. I don't think that common view is one thing. I don't believe that it has there's one right system at all. Like I completely reject that idea out of hand. But that doesn't mean that there aren't many systems that have a lot of wisdom in them about how to live together, because part of biophysical realities is resource. That's a big part, but part of it is also like living with other humans and sharing and having a common sort of way of being. And I feel like tradition offers a lot of insight into like, how do we live together? It doesn't necessarily offer that much. And like, how do you, rotate cattle to, get the best production out of your grass? I don't think traditionalism, I mean, there are traditions that do that, it's not maybe religious traditions, but like if you talk to people who've been growing grass for a long time, like there's a lot of wisdom there. That's a way that wisdom is, in fact, that's a better way than to read papers about it by far. Talk to somebody who's been doing it for 40 years. So there's a lot of ways to learn how this world works. There's a lot of ways to learn, like, different systems that hew more or less closely to whatever it is that this world is. But I think tradition does offer, and is especially around like living together, which is, again, that's what it's all going to come down to after, if there is an after, right? Like, so I guess that's my half-hearted defense of that as well.
I'd like to just follow up just quickly is what I was talking about when I'm referring to traditional values, I'm talking about the intrinsic values that are required within us for us to actually get people to join forces and organize community itself. That's what we're missing in this kind of culture war at the community level. People aren't knowing really that they are divided into these different ideologies. So the challenge of an organizer like myself is I'm dealing with that existing reality. For example, in Hawaii, they got the history of colonial past. You got the transition from a plantation to a tourist economy, where most of the production now is for tourists coming, stay in the hotels. Then you've got literally 6 types of, ethnic groups involved in farming that are divided. You've got geographic division, pretty challenging. So the government itself tried to bring people together to produce more 20 years ago, didn't lead anywhere. There's current efforts to do that. It's a challenge. And the main challenge is that it's really hard to get people to work together. So these values, what I would call these traditional values of how to hold space for these kinds of groups and people to work together across these divides, that's the key. That is, I believe, the most important thing. That's what I learned from Sarvodaya in Sri Lanka, is how do you use what they call, awakening of your personality, your capacity to share, your capacity to cooperate, collaborate. You have to have that in order to bring these networks and communities together. And that's the level that I've been focusing on, more practical. So when I was focusing on like traditional values, I was meaning how can you apply those character traits that are within people that are kind of atrophied to some extent? How can you help people to activate them? It's like going to the gym, working out. You got to build these kind of capacities within people so they can cooperate. And I'm like what Ellie's doing and talking about in terms of bringing community together. That's what gives me hope, because I've seen people's capacity to do that, desire to do it outside of a natural disaster. Obviously, when you have a natural disaster, what happens is it triggers this kind of survival mechanism personally and collectively, where people open up their hearts and they go beyond all these silos, all these different divisions for a time. But then they come back. Then we come back to, say, normal consciousness, which to me is like abnormal consciousness, but say it's normal consciousness, which is to be in our little bubble. And what I think could be happening is that we're in this kind of perpetual sense of global crises, which could trigger that liminality or that sense of kind of a survival mechanism where I hope that it leads more and more people to want to share, want to get back to these basic principles of cooperation and neighborhoods and community. And I really see that happening more and more people recognizing that you just, system reform is not a likely path, and more people want to have agency. And I think it's important that they are able to do something concretely and practically. And I found that these values, these spiritual values, are important in terms of cultivating community. So that's kind of another take on it.
Greg, I have a feeling you're itching to jump in. Go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I think that culture and traditions are and always have been mostly artificial, although they touch primary experience. They're inventive and creative, but that doesn't mean that they're unreal, and it doesn't mean that they're not deep. They are as deep, sometimes deeper than language itself. And when it comes to attacks against traditions of various sorts or conservatism, traditionalists and conservatives have some really good ammunition for being defensive or counterattacking or for further polarizing, because there's a lot of liberal, intolerant intellectual elitism, which is not at all inclusive of mainstream society, of most humans, even today. Never mind people, our background where like 90% of people lived on a farm maybe 150 years ago or less. And many liberal or socialist ideas are very, very theoretical, very equalitarian, and they're about theoretically flat structures of organizing, peer-to-peer structures, one could even say. I'm a P2P theorist, and I think peer-to-peer organizing is super important on all levels of activity and different relationships between different projects and communities, etc. But hierarchy happens, except hierarchy doesn't have to be the modern, like the modern traditional, I sometimes say, bureaucratic model, whereby modern political institutions and corporations are all structured by this like pyramid of power, top-down power of departmentalized coercive authority and this machine-like structure that determines the rules and the outcomes and often does not allow real human relationship and creativity. But hierarchy does happen in nature, obviously. We're all made of cells and organs, and we are organisms and communities of organisms as ecosystems. There's a lot of hierarchy involved in natural or emergent design. There also needs to be hierarchy and modularity in any artificial design. So, that's an important thing. And I want to note one more thing quickly. Ellie, when you refer to life today being very highly intellectualized, I thought of mediation, and I just have to give a plug to my very favorite short story is The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster, which was 1909, but I think incredibly prescient. It's a dystopian tale about a society whereby technology and the cultural evolution along with that technology led away towards life being more and more mediated away from primary experience, more and more theoretical, more and more abstracted, and just totally disastrous. And it's a beautifully written story, and probably a tie for the most important thing I ever read.
Pretty prophetic, it seems to me, in many ways. Ellie, I want to pick up on this string about, if, for example, the energy grid goes down or all of a sudden food doesn't show up in the supermarkets, what do people do? And I'm wondering, and how can we prepare for these contingencies? I'm wondering, one, I think in Doomer Optimism podcast and land, that's kind of what we're trying to do is like have these conversations now, start laying the groundwork for what might come next. But we're a tiny fraction of the population. Most folks, many folks are just too busy, or they're just worried about work and paying bills, or they just don't care, or whatever it is. And so in terms of like just having the skills, for example, of like, oh, suddenly we can't take food for granted. We're going to band together community and grow food. Well, there's entrenched ownership structures of land. Are all of these ownership structures going to collapse, or is it going to become more of a neo-feudal situation? And I'm just wondering how you see, like, you seem to be pretty optimistic that we're going to buck up, but it just seems like there's so many legacy kind of power imbalances and skill, and just lack of skill sets to be able to live in this way, that I wish I could be as optimistic as you. And I hope that through these conversations we can prepare for reasons to be optimistic. So I want to hand it to you.
Yeah. So here's where I tell you all the good news. I'm kidding. But I mean, so like I don't know if I would say I'm optimistic, but I'm super practical, right? So like, let's make some buckets. The first one is there's really a catastrophic situation, right? Like, just massive crop failures across lots of parts of the country, and the government is overconstrained. The federal government can't respond to everything. And so, we really just don't have food. There's going to be people that die in that scenario, right? So like, I'm not saying that we're not going to see, and I'm not saying that we are going to see, like, I've been worried for 12 years that might happen, right? That we're going to just be seeing things that we're not used to seeing in this country. And it's almost impossible to imagine that today. But then I think, this is happening every day in Africa to such a profound scale. Like, it is possible, right? So, not taking that off the table, but as you're laying out sort of like, this is the challenge before us, right? Like, there's kind of two main things that I think about. I mean, there's literally what it takes to survive, to keep your body going. And that's fairly simplistic. I mean, food, water, and shelter, and like not freezing to death and not dying of heat. And of course, that could be a pretty brutal lifestyle, and there's no medicine and so on. And like, a lot of people wouldn't really be able to handle that. And I don't know if that's what we're talking about. I doubt it. I don't think everything's going to go offline. But like, fundamentally, right, how do you get enough food, water, and shelter and like heat for your people, right? And like, is that available in these within walking and kind of mobility distance? Like, that's like worst case scenario. And then anything above that, if you did like an analysis of your city, is like, well, sure, we could do that, but we would need to have this much gasoline, because we're actually building on the entire region of the state versus within like the 10 miles around us. Like, those kinds of things, right, are like, that's the bottom layer. The second piece that sort of interrupts what is possible, like fundamentally theoretically possible, is what you describe, is the ownership structures, is the existing cultural like orientation towards the system that's creating the problem that's endangering our lives at the base. And that's anyone's kind of, that's like the no man's land, right? So like I've seen some stuff that really deeply concerns me coming out of Arizona already around water. They're facing sort of water shortages in lower parts of Phoenix. And so what's happening is people are buying up land in Yuma, right? Like rural areas right outside of Phoenix so that they can have the water and pipe it into the city. And so, you know, you imagine like basically it's like, okay, so we've sucked resources from like the third world, the second world, and now the first, like it's, you know, the gates are at it's at the city gates, right? And we're going to keep doing that until someone turns on the tap in Phoenix and there's nothing left. Like that's the kind of thing, you know, I don't think anyone on this call is expecting to put themselves into, right? Like we, you know, don't live in a city of 6 million in the middle of the desert when there's water problems like on the news, right? Like that's not a good strategy. But these things are going to happen, and they're going to happen right up until the edge, probably, like according to the current vector that they're on. And so I think where we really, you know, where this conversation really sits is like, to what extent can we influence that before it happens? Because like right now, it's okay for a hedge fund to go in there and buy land so that it can sell that water from the ag land to the city and totally destroy that land and probably lose all the soil. I mean, that's like a sin, right? Like that, like it's insane, right? So, you know, the kinds of things that we're used to that nobody really like has stood up to say, whoa, how is this legal? How is that actually acceptable? Like we have to have those dialogue. Like if we're not the boundary line, then who is, right? And like if we don't start a boundary line around this stuff, then as we were saying in the original thread, like it's going to happen because people are literally like experiencing the boundary in their physical bodies, right? So like I think that, you know, there needs to be some hybrid approach of what Richard is putting out there about reaching out and building collaborative networks and building the, you know, the sort of, we know each other, we know our resources, we are learning skills, we are just learning how to live in communion again. I mean, like that's a lot of negotiation and things that you need to figure out. But then also not only, you know, sort of building that to like feel good, but also building that to like have a sort of a force for protective, like action, right, in advance of, especially with like foreign players coming into a local space, because, you know, ultimately resource, and sorry, I'm just like continuing, but like ultimately resource and like survival is it's a fundamentally local problem, right? Like if you get food from somewhere else, it's still local food, and the road that it traveled on was still a local truck. Like everything is local, right? So as we face a system that is not able to respond to problems, as we face a higher incidence of problems, we have to think about how we allow others who are not local to come into our local spaces. And the last thing I'll say, that there was a really great precedent that I saw around this in Key West. So after COVID, like cruise ships, you know, weren't running, and they saw that their river, the ocean water ran clean for the first time in like 30 years. And they were like, oh, wow, this is really bad. Like, let's not let this come back, right? And do the damage again. And so there were like two brothers or something like that who went and like caught, you know, 2,500, they needed 2,500 signatures to get something on the ballot. They got 5,000 really easily. And I think it's things like that. Like I read that in an article and I was like, wow, you know, it's never occurred to me to actually try to do something like that, you know, and what would be the response? I mean, I've seen statistics that like 80% of people are convinced that climate change is a serious problem. And like, you know, we're probably just not reaching them because we're not trying to yet.
Ellie, I just want to throw in one more example of like reaching the edge that's happening right now is with the energy crisis in Europe. Deforestation is a huge concern. Like people basically like nobody can buy fuel wood, right, for their wood stoves because they're worried about heating this winter. I heard something about that we're kind of devastating forests in the U.S. Southeast to make, you know, for the wood pellet industry to send over to Europe to keep people warm. And so this is a case where if a higher density fuel becomes less available and people have to resort to a lower density fuel like trees, that, you know, there's concerns that we could just we think we're already devastating forests. I mean, this would just go on overdrive. And this is one of those wicked problems where it's like, what do you do? Like, what do you do about this? People are going to die if they don't heat their homes. Anyway, I just want to throw that example out. I thought it was kind of similar to the Phoenix example. But,
yeah, I mean, we're in a precarious and unbelievable situation, right? Like, if our systems that kind of flow underneath to keep everything going stop, there's a lot of overshot. And the really serious situation is like those systems are really at risk, right? Like from like multiple vectors. So, I mean, like you can go down to lower level solutions, but it has to be in advance, right? Like if you're in a cold environment and you're used to not being aware of that because you have central heat, like that's fantastic. It's an affordance though. And so like, do you have really warm coats, right? Like,
right.
I mean, the Mongols wore fur, like, these things are very old technologies and they don't go out of style. So, I mean, that's one thing, like prepare yourself, right? I mean, none of us know what's going to happen, but if you don't have like some kind of ability to take care of your body yourself, then you might not make it through challenge, and that's kind of like your choice. Beyond that, I think that what we really need to set up is like, and this is what I'm trying to build the foundation for, is like, let's really start managing our resources intelligently, right? Like, I mean, it's, we don't know how much forest there is. We don't know how much water there is. Nobody's really measuring that. And if it is getting measured, it's probably really narrowly, and it's being put in a database that's on like NOAA.gov, right? And, if you open that up, then you can know how bad things are, right? Like, we need to say, this is a crisis, and we actually have to like work on this problem as diligently as we build cars and, all the other stuff, right? And like, I think that the reason that that's not happening, and there's two reasons. One is we see this as like, oh my God, we're going to die. Like, it's just going to be this like mass, it's going to be like this apocalyptic, like single event that takes everybody out. And, and it's really easy to see that because like, we actually can't define this. It's an uncertainty, and it's a huge risk, and it's a staggering risk, right? Like, it's like, it took me like years after college, I got my degree in this, like to just deal with the despair of like, how is it possible that everybody like built this system to basically die before I was even born? Like, like, oh wait, as if how can I be upset about that? Like, we have colonialism for 500 years. Like, what where are we, right? Like, when is this place, and so like, there's just the truth that like, this is just a bad design. And then there's the reality that like, as long as it remains amorphous, it's really hard to get people to look at it, right? It's really hard to get people to say, yeah, I can commit resources to that. And it's also really hard to know what needs to be done. So like, I think that wherever there is optimism, and I'm not sure like what I would say the prognosis is, right? Is it like 5% or like 95? I don't know. But wherever there is optimism, it's going to be based on really good connectivity, the ability to manage resources across a network. So you can like collaborate like trees do to share resources. We have more food here. We can help you out this year. You can help us out next year. Like, that's how things used to work. And also like, so the coordinating between people, and also like the ability to coordinate response to resource collapse and resource degradation and resource regeneration and resource increase, right? Like, the world, like, as you say, the example that you put out, we're getting rid of more trees in the Southeast, and trees
to release, like none of the climate models, I don't think, have accounted for more deforestation due to energy, dense energy, rapid decline.
Right. Like that was, we didn't anticipate clear cutting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But also we can also plant trees, right? And the only reason we don't is because there's no money and there's no land. And those are that's based on those like make-believe ownership structures, right? Like, I mean, technically there's land and technically there's money.
There is some money, right? There is, like, just a shout out to any landowners out there, right? Like, ask about the Conservation Reserve Program, ask about, things like EQIP, go talk to you might not want, I mean, I know a lot of people might be resistant to go talk to your local bureaucrat, but like, Man, there is money. I got I got a lot of money and planted a lot of trees this year myself. So that's there.
One of our local food system organizers in kind of like Southern Appalachia, Sarah Day, who we had on the podcast, she runs Accelerate Appalachia, all about kind of creating nature-based businesses and things. They recently got a $20 million grant or something to basically work with, and she's been working with much more shoestring budget up until now. And so, yeah, I mean, there does seem to be some shifts. And now it's a matter of, are we going to use these resources well? Are we going to coordinate well, as you're saying, Ellie? We're kind of bumping up a little bit. I think we'll try and wrap up in about 10 minutes or so. Yeah. I guess I want to maybe give everyone kind of final word about maybe one, like, if you want to talk a little bit more about kind of what you're doing and what you're seeing that gives you optimism. Greg, I love you to talk about peer-to-peer. Ellie, I love you to talk about your networking work and what you're seeing that's hopeful. Richard, about your symbiotic networks. Nathan, you working in the Corn Belt with your own farm, and the psychology of the people around you and other farmers. Anything that you want to kind of conclude with, and final kind of expression.
I can go first. If no one else, Greg, do you want to? I see you were just about to jump in. Okay. So, so I mean, where I've been networking most recently is with the bureaucrats, right? With sort of government. And I can say that there's a lot of, like, everyone knows what the problems are and everyone wants to solve them, except for maybe like Shell, right? And they know what the problems are too. So like everybody is looking for a way. And it's a big problem space, and it's really unclear. And so I think the people like us, right, who like feel sort of like disaffected because we've been thinking about this for so long and it's so absurd, tend to say, this is just a wash. But I think that we should really think of ourselves as leaders and go across, these lines of thought and also identity, right? Like, work with bureaucrats. They've got money and they've got resources. Work with companies. They have money, right? Like, if we don't tell them what they should be doing differently, then how are they going to know, right? Like, we really need to try to, inspire everyone to recognize that this is something that can be approached. And, and like with a really specific ask, right? Like, can you give us some money? Because we really like to plant trees, or something like that, right? Like, I think we could get a lot going that way.
Thank you, Ellie. I agree very strongly. I have a focus on, sometimes I use the term deep adaptation, but there's a lot of ways to frame this. Certainly, I've mentioned progressive decentralization. I think also progressive reorganization, and my own emphasis being on inclusive organizing, which relates very closely to progressive decentralization, because I think that inclusive discussions, inclusive design, and inclusive decision processes tend to decentralize and distribute any excess of power and resources. And for that, community is the key. And I don't think we've touched on this directly, but I do want to note that if the maximum power principle is, something at least nearly equivalent to a law of the universe, I would suggest, is it not possible that the power accumulating structures are not competitive individuals, but are actually inclusive communities? And I think that inclusive communities can outcompete competitive communities, especially if we don't lose the vast majority of technology and of wisdom we've acquired over many, many thousands of years, including even some of the very modern technology. Let's see. how to make that happen, I want to give a shout out to the concept of mutual aid networks and mutual aid networks, which do or sometimes don't use formal mutual credit systems. And you guys are all probably familiar with this, but a mutual credit system is a system whereby credits and debits all add up to zero and there's no fiat currency. And I got an interesting idea from the experience and also the thoughts of Art Brock, one of the co-founders of Holochain, where he's noticed that mutual credit systems are very valuable, especially I think for interactions between strangers and near strangers in a marketplace-like setting. But as people build personal relationships, they stop doing that formal stuff. And I think that might be pretty close to a law of nature. As we grow in real relationship with individuals, with families and teams, with small communities, up to and perhaps beyond the Dunbar number, we stop using the training wheels or the crutches of whatever technological tools we use to create supposedly equitable interactions in like mutual credit or the dollar, any kind of currency system, which of course those systems that predominate now are very extractive and exploitative. So I think we can grow in small to large communities very inclusively, and I'm working for us to develop reversible technology, not dependency, but as long as technology suffices. But it all starts with the foundation of relationships, communities.
Nice. You cut out a little bit there at the end, Greg, but I think we caught most of that. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I tried to end with it all starts with relationships and communities.
Cool. Richard, Nathan, either one?
Nathan, you want to go? You want me?
I can. So, man, I feel like there's a lot of things to tie up here. So what I'm going to do is go further into Doomer and then see if I can talk my way through into optimism. And I might get a little trippy, and I'll do it quickly. Because my mind is really on this. You talked about managing resources intelligently. I'm like, well, good luck with that. Like that was just like my mind went there because, we live in a world, like global capitalism. I'm going to be like the hippie, you throw out the capitalism as a boogeyman, but yeah, it is. Because what it does, and it has done in its entire existence, is it utilizes resources, man. It exploits resources and distributes them to like all over. Like it is a resource using machine. That is what it is for. It makes consumption go. And like, it doesn't want to slow down. It can't slow down. Like that's what it does. It just fucking eats. And so like, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with something that is somebody if there's a resource shortage here, we're going to exploit it over here and like we'll buy up land and take their water to ship it over here without regard to the people who are there. We'll cut these trees. Like that's what it does. Like that's what it's designed to do. It's the system functioning exactly as it's built. It's inherently exploitive. And so part of this is absolutely resisting that. Here like relationships, community, these are ways to do that. But like, again, it so shapes the way that we see the world, right? That we view, our place in it. You talked about survival being a really pretty simple process, which it is, right? Like if it's, if you're really, your back's to it, you just have to eat and stay warm. But can we, as people choose, right? In the context of capitalism, right? Can we as people choose to be less comfortable, right? Can we choose to to use less when it's available, when it's being sold to us, when we're being told that that's what you're supposed to do. There's resources available. They're there. You just have to take them, and maybe you have to pay. Like, it creates this scarce, this sense that like I have to get more. Like it's what it does, and so like we have to wake up from that. We have to collectively wake up from that. We have to collectively see that ideology for what it is. And that's a hell of a lift, right? And it does, require relationships with one another. It does require community. It does require, I think, values that are higher than consumption. Capitalism has displaced values, right? Like you can go in and just do something fucking shitty, and just say, well, it's just business, right? Like that's fine. That's what it is. It's like capitalism, kind of like exerts itself from the need to have ethics and morality. And we need to reassert values. We need to reassert that no, doing things for money isn't a legitimate motivation, actually. Contrary to, Ayn Rand, which says, like essentially it's the only motivation that's pure. So there's a lot there, and there's times we have moments, we have opportunities to wake up. Like crisis, wakes people up. Like there's moments when really bad things happen and you kind of see the world fresh and your concepts are kind of washed away for a moment. And there's these opportunities for connections. Like when you have life crises, like there's these moments in life in which you kind of fundamentally see things differently for a moment. And, those scripts that always run, pause for a second. You're like, wait. And so we have to facilitate those. We have to create those, not crises, but opportunities for, seeing things, opportunities for stripping away those scales. And this is not something we'll get into, but it is part of my whole thing, which is I think psychedelic medicines are freaking awesome for this. So that's another episode.
Nathan, we'll get you on to talk about that. That'll definitely happen. Go for it, Richard.
Well, yeah. Hey, this has been fun. It's been a real pleasure, Jason, to hang out with you guys and hear about things that I'm concerned about, and especially community resilience, and what Greg had just was talking about, mutual aid. I hadn't really thought about that context for my work, but yeah, definitely relevant. I wanted to leave with, two things. One is, and I wanted to bring up what's happening in Sri Lanka just briefly, and a parable that I think was really meaningful to me in the early 60s when they were dealing with they had food crisis back then in Sri Lanka. And Dr. Aryaratne was starting to work in these villages, in these communities. He was having a hard challenge, getting these, really poor families to send their children to the preschool that the community had built. So what he came up with was he called it the matchbox. And in the matchbox, he asked every family in a village to put a couple grains of dal and rice in a matchbox. And everybody did that. And they sent all those matchboxes with a little bit of dal and a little bit of rice to the preschool. And they built a community kitchen. And now all the parents felt, wow, my kids can go to school, they're going to get fed. And I bring it up because it was a simple thing. And at that time, it affected thousands of communities. They just followed that idea of sharing and that kind of mindset. So I've heard a lot about that too. And what I'm passionate about is cultural change. I bring it up because in Sri Lanka, they literally built 150 community kitchens in the first 5 months of the year in dealing with this current food crisis. And they got 600 home gardens and 25 food banks. So I'd help them build a national food banking system. So they're going to literally, they've been able to mobilize people through sharing and collaborating, and they've helped to, provide food collectively for 300,000 families, so 1.5 million people in the first 5 months of this year. And they did that through their infrastructure, which are these resilient community networks. And I bring this up because it's really kind of kind of given me a shot in the arm in terms of my own work. And I've launched the Symbiotic Culture Lab, which is what it is. And like Ellie, it's for innovators and others that are working in this field, primarily in bioregions, to build resilient community networks in different sectors. And launched that about a month ago, and a number of communities were building local food system networks in Florida, New York, actually, one in Switzerland, and a number of others, on the West Coast. So really exploring, trying to figure out how to automate this, how to provide tools so that it's not dependent on me or an organization. So I've been really looking at this kind of fractal organizing. But in order to do that, it can't be dependent on me or like a singular personality. It's based on principles. So I've been looking for that for decades. Like, what are those principles that are inherently scalable that people can do themselves, and principles of community collective intelligence? And how can they do that without having to raise money or build a formal organization, but do it through these new distributed networks? And I'm real excited about that. I see the potential for it. And I believe it's possible through our collective work of those of us here on this call. And there's got to be millions of people like us that are really already doing things in their various domains at different scales. I think what's happening is there's like Mother Nature, it's like we're responding, in a sense, or like enzymes. Maybe we're helping to bring this all together. And Jason, thank you for offering this vehicle to start to do that and to continue to, bring us together and to, figure it out, adapt, thrive.
Let's figure it out, adapt, and thrive. I think that's a good way to end. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I just want to put the offer out there that when people are interviewed on Doomer Optimism, we consider them part of the collective, even if they don't. Being part of the collective also means that if there's somebody that, if you want to host a conversation with somebody or the panel, you're welcome to do that. Just reach out to Ashley or I or Tress or one of the other folks. But yeah, it's the whole point of having conversations like this. I thought this was wonderful. So thank you, everyone. This will be up in a few weeks. Hopefully.
Cool.
See you.
Cool.
It's been a delight to meet you all and talk with you all.
Yep.
Thank you. Are we feeling more optimistic? Or more
I am.
Yeah.
in the middle?
Yeah, talking with you folks makes me more optimistic, for sure.
Cool.
Right. Glad to help. Bye.
Bye, guys.